On the overhead, I have a map of the world in the area of what's known as the Levant. Now, of course, we've got Western Europe and Russia, Northern Africa. But between Antioch and Alexandria, we have what is known as the Levant, Levant. And Antioch's up in Syria, and Alexandria is on the western part of the delta of the Nile River. And it was built, of course, by Alexander the Great. Now, in between there is the land of Palestine. And this whole area was very, very important to Rome, not only at its inception and growth, but all the time of its existence. That's why they continually sent men down there as client kings or governors. That's what Pontius Pilate was, and so forth. They had to have stability here because they got a lot of their food there. It's rich in mineral wealth. It was important strategically for the military. And so therefore, what we have with all of the Herods is actually a bid for this land and control of this land. Who is going to rule? Now, it's important to note that the Levant as well at the end times becomes important too. Rome again, Western Europe, comes down in the form of Antichrist, signs a peace treaty with those in the Levant for 7 years. 3.5 years later, Antichrist comes to Jerusalem, which is the city in the navel of the earth, the center of the world as far as God's concerned. And he wants to rule from there as the King of Kings, King of the Jews, and use Jerusalem as the capital city. So that's basically what we're talking about and what Christmas is all about. Jesus was born King of the Jews. Now, it wasn't until Paul came that he told us that by grace we Gentiles, by grace, get our salvation, that what Christ was doing on the cross, he was doing for our particular salvation apart from Israel. Now, he also did it for Israel under that economy. But apart from Israel, Jesus Christ was working what Paul calls his mystery work in redemption, which we Gentiles have a part of. All right, so that is your new vocabulary word for the day, the Levant. And it's a very, very important word because it's an important place. Now on the overhead we have centered or placed the middle of the Levant. And you can see that we have the Sea of Galilee and also the Dead Sea. And that basically this was the area of Herod the Great. This is the area that he ruled. Jerusalem, of course, is right about here. He built the seaport, Caesarea. Capernaum was up here. We have Tyre and Sidon up here. These are very, very important cities. And over here we have Caesarea Philippi and so forth. So Herod the Great basically ruled from here on over and so forth. Now, later on, his grandson, Herod Agrippa, actually ruled the whole lot. He ruled even over here in Transjordania. This is TJ, Transjordania, and he ruled that as well. Actually, this is where his relatives lived. Doris, Herod the Great's first wife, was an Arabian or a Nabatean, and that's where they lived. And they were fantastic horsemen and so forth. And that's where Herod the Great actually got the army, the cavalry that helped Julius Caesar out of the jam there in Egypt. So this is an important parcel of ground. So now you will know whenever we talk about these various places that here is Jerusalem. Basically, much of the transaction goes on there in that city. But there was a lot of business that transpired by going up to Caesarea. Caesarea was a coastal town. Actually, it was basically nothing. And Caesar Augustus said to Herod the Great, no one can build a seaport on the coast of Palestine because it's too rocky. And Herod the Great said, I'm going to do it. And he made Caesarea, naming it after Caesar, the most beautiful city in the world at that time, even more beautiful than Rome. It was said of Caesar Augustus that he took the city of brick and made it a city of marble regarding Rome. But Herod the Great outdid him and named the city after him. Then, of course, when Herod the Great died, he divvied up the territory. Now remember, he just had this part, and this part. Later on, Agrippa first got this part, but he just had these three. This was named Iturea, this was named Galilee, and this, of course, was Judea. And much of the action now is going to take place here as Herod Philip gets this territory. This is the second Herod Philip that we talk about. And then most of the other Herods get this territory, whether it's Herod Antipas, Herod Agrippa I or II. But like I said, many of them did claim much more than just was what was located here, as far as what King Herod himself originally had. All right, with that in mind, let's note the people we're going to be looking at this evening. We have thoroughly covered Herod the Great. Surely you know much about this man and how he figures in history. He is both instrumental and detrimental. We owe him a lot, actually. Herod the Great was such a great man and instrumental in so many things in building the Olympic Games. He built Athens, where Paul preached. He saved the Jewish nation time and again, even though he wasn't a Jew. He had some ulterior motives, but originally he had a wonderful personality and a beautiful old sin nature. He is a typical example of a do-gooder religiously until he became a monster. Now, he had some children. And the ones that are going to figure in our study for this evening are Aristobulus, whom he later strangled, and then Bernice. Actually, this was his niece. Aristobulus and Bernice got married, and they had a child by the name of Herod Agrippa I. Now, this is the first fellow that we are going to study. Now, please remember that his grandfather, Herod the Great, killed his father, Aristobulus, by strangulation. So, where was Herod Agrippa? Well, he was in the land. But when Herod the Great strangled Aristobulus, his mother, Mariamne, took him to Rome. And actually, Tiberius Caesar raised him in the palace. So Herod Agrippa was educated with the best education. He was in the best household in all of Rome. You can't get any better than Caesar, supposedly. And so anyway, he was raised there and sort of adopted by Tiberius Caesar as a son. Well, here's an interesting thing. He also was quite the playboy. He had lots of money, but he spent it on frivolous things. And he became known as Agrippa the Penniless. So he went from Rome, from the tutelage and the supervision of Tiberius Caesar himself, back to his homeland. Now you'll remember that in northwestern Palestine was the area or the region of Galilee. It's third-class province in the area of Galilee. Who was there but his uncle, auntie, and his sister, Herodias. Now we have Agrippa I, the Penniless, coming from Rome and Tiberius' household back to his kinfolk, saying, I'm penniless, look here, no more money, my wallet's empty, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, I'm here to sponge off you for the rest of my life. Well, the problem with that is that Antipas the fox, the ruler of Galilee, didn't like him, and Herodias just saw him as in the way. She wanted to be a queen, and she didn't have time to entertain this guy. So Antipas the fox gave him a job. You know what Agrippa the First did? He was a meat inspector in Galilee. Talk about a state job. he got involved with the Department of Agriculture and USDA, and he'd stamp all the meat there. And that's what he became. Now, the problem with that was that he kept up his playboy lifestyle, and he ate a lot of food at the palace. So, three things caused him to be one of the greatest men. Like I said, he ruled over more land than all of them. One of the greatest men in this whole story. Though he wasn't a genius, he was pretty bright. He went there, and there were three things that happened to him. One was a drunken party. The Tyrians wanted to throw a party for Herod Antipas, the fox. So they invited him from Capernaum to come up to Tyre, and of course, Agrippa I came there with him. And they put on one wing-ding of a party, let me tell you. We'll explain the Roman orgies in just a little bit. But it was one wing-ding of a party, and they were all drinking, and all of a sudden, they became uninhibited, and people who drink become uninhibited in different ways. And evidently, Herod the fox could not hold his liquor, and his true feelings came out. And he said in front of all of the Tyrians there in the city of Tyre and Sidon, he said, "Agrippa, you're nothing but a no-good bum. You're a loafer. You won't work. You've come down to mooch off of us, and I wish you'd leave." And Agrippa I said some things and likewise, and made gestures and sayings and so forth. And there was a brawl. Well, naturally, Agrippa couldn't stay there. So this drunken party made him go back home to Tiberias. Tiberius at this particular point was 53 years of age. He was on the Isle of Capri, and though he was emperor, he decided to live the rest of his life in Roman orgies on this island. Well, he said, "Tiberius, will you take me back?" "Yes, but you have to work. Tutor my grandson." "Okay, watch out though. There's a guy by the name of Caligula who wants my throne." Well, he was raised with Caligula. And instead of tutoring the grandson of Tiberius, he began to cultivate a friendship with Caligula. Now, here's the second thing that happened to him. He and Caligula were riding in a chariot, and they were looking over Rome. And as they were looking over Rome, in a moment of impulse, Agrippa I said to Caligula, who was not yet ruler, "I wish Tiberius would die." Now remember, Tiberius adopted him, raised him, educated him, fed him all of his life till he was grown up and penniless and went back home. And Tiberius showed him all of this good time. And he said to Caligula, "I wish that Tiberius were dead and you would reign in his stead, Caligula." The only problem was, the driver of the chariot was a freed slave by Tiberius by the name of Eutychus. Now Eutychus is listening to all of this and makes his way back to the Isle of Capri, tells Tiberius, and Tiberius arrests Agrippa I. So with chains, heavy chains, he is in prison. 6 months later, Tiberius dies. The first act of Caligula as the new emperor is to free Agrippa I. And he said, "Because you are my friend and said what you did and went out on a limb for me," he said, I'm going to take those chains, iron chains, and weigh them and give you a chain of gold. And I'm going to give you the tetrarchy of your uncle Philip, who died as well. So down he went, right across the Sea of Galilee from you-know-who? Herod the Fox and his sister Herodias. So now you've got these two people at odds. And here goes Herod the Fox and Herodias. I mean to tell you, history records that they're not sure which one blew the highest gasket when this happened. But Caligula placed him right on the throne of his uncle Herod Philip on the east side of Galilee. So here you have these two opposing factions in the form of family members. So what happens? Well, remember we kept saying this morning that Herodias gave Herod the Fox a lot of bad information. She said, Herod, I want you to march up there to Caligula and tell him that scamp Agrippa the First is no good and that we should have that territory. You remember, she wanted to be the queen of it all. We should have that territory, and you need to go down there and go up there and tell Caligula that Pontius Pilate is no good too. Now remember, Luke chapter 23, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, Herod Antipas and Pontius Pilate were made friends. And why? Because he kept writing letters to the emperor saying Pontius Pilate is a weak sister, he's no good, and you ought to get rid of him. So they were at odds, and they became friends, but there was still friction between them. We want it all, says Herodias. And Herod the Fox says, you know, I'm getting kind of old for this traipsing back and forth to Rome. Why don't we just stay here and be content with Galilee? No. Her aggressiveness had to get the whole territory. So they went to Caligula. Now at this time, he was on the eastern coast of Italy. It was summertime. He was taking just a little bit of a vacation, but he still did state's business. So here they come into the room overlooking the sea, and they had, history records, a bay window there where you could see the ocean and so forth. So here's Caligula sitting on the throne. Here comes Antipas the fox and Herodias in. They're going to complain about Agrippa. The only thing is, they have forgotten that Agrippa I and Caligula are best of friends. Caligula is sitting there because Agrippa went out on a limb for him and so forth. Well, Herod Agrippa I heard that they were going. He sent his devoted servant Fortunatus with a message. And Fortunatus arrived just as they were going in the door with this message. He's hanging around the front of the door, and here they come. And there was a standing order. Anytime Agrippa I sent a message or came into town, he had precedence over anyone else. So in walks Fortunatus. Here is the fox and Herodias, and Fortunatus hands him this note and says, would you please ask my uncle about the 70,000 stands of armor that he has? You see, he didn't need those because if he was going to be in compliance with the rules and laws of Rome, then he didn't need 70,000 stands of armor. And ask him about the fact that he is negotiating with the Parthians to overthrow Rome and become king of the whole area. Would you please ask him? So Caligula says, Antipas, have you been negotiating with the Parthians? And Antipas does the double take and says, yes, sir. Do you have 70,000 stands of armor? But what are you going to use those for? Yes, sir, I have them. He said, right now, you're stripped of everything. You'll never go back to Galilee. You're banished to the south of France. And there, both of them starved to death. And at that particular point, that's when Herod Agrippa I got all of the territory that we mentioned because of his actions with Caligula. All right, now, that brings us, had to give you all that history because now that brings us to verse 1 of chapter 12. Now about that time, Herod the king, this is Agrippa the first, stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James the brother of John with the sword. Now this is Herod Agrippa the first. How did he get down to Jerusalem? Remember, he snitched on Antipas, and because of that, as a favor, Caligula gave him the whole territory, and he moved his headquarters from Caesarea Philippi down to Jerusalem to rule over the whole thing. Jerusalem's a bigger city. That's how he got in Jerusalem when the apostles were there, and he killed James, the brother of John. Why? Because he saw it pleased the Jews. That's the story of Christmas. We do these things and perpetuate the myth and the lies and the tradition because it pleases other people. We do it because other people do it, and we have to keep on perpetuating the lie. So he proceeded to take Peter also. Now he put him in prison, but he could not kill him because it was the Jewish feast days at this time. So he had to wait at least 1 week. In the meantime, the angel of the Lord came, verse number 7. The light shined in the prison. He smote Peter on the side, raised him up, said, arise quickly. His chains fell from his hand, and Peter escaped. I think that's kind of neat. With the shepherds, the light shines and they sing a song, and with the angels in the heavenlies and so forth. Here, the light shined and he still had to kick Peter on the side. He must have been snoring pretty good. I don't know. But so he escapes. Verse 18. Now as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers what was become of Peter. I mean, how did the chains fall off of his hands? Who came in here? Somebody had to come in and let him go. Somebody had to unlock the gates. And remember, there were double and triple gates. Not only did he have a lock on his own room, but there were several locks to the outside of the prison. I mean, this is no easy task that the angel performed. When Herod sought for him, he found him, he examined the keepers, and commanded they should be put to death. I want you to see something, the last part of this verse here. Herod, at this point, was beginning to really become a monster. Because religiously he had been raised a Jew, and he wanted them to lavish on him all of the honors of a Jew. Now remember, he was part Jew. Why? Because Aristobulus was the son of Mariamne of the house of Hashmon, one of the Maccabeans. So he was half Jewish. So therefore, he wanted to please the Jews. He was very insistent upon pleasing them. One time history records that he was reading in the Bible where no Gentile should take part of the service on the Feast of Tabernacles. And the high priest came and said, "We love you so much, Agrippa the First, because you have been so pleasant to us and have promoted our religion that we're just going to count you as one of us, a purebred Jew." And so he got to participate in these various things. But he became a monster and started putting people to death. But now note the last part of verse 19. But he began to get bored. Why? Because he went from Judea to Caesarea and there abode. Imperfect linear action start, he moved his headquarters there. In other words, he went from Jerusalem to Caesarea. Why? Because he began to want to be deified himself. He went from worshiping the true and living God, at least whatever semblance there was under Judaism, to wanting personal worship. And remember, basically that's what all of these men wanted, to be King of the Jews, Messiah of Israel. So, Herod was highly displeased with them of Tyre and Sidon. Now, why was he displeased with them? Remember the story. He went there to that party, and Antipas the fox belittled him, and all of the people of Tyre and Sidon laughed at him. Now he's king of all of the area, and you know what he does? He puts a grain embargo in the cities of Tyre and Sidon. Now they're hungry. They get the majority of their food from the Levant, the breadbasket of that area. And so therefore, now they're starving to death. You can only eat fish so much, and they go to the Mediterranean Sea and fish, and that's great, but you need a little bit of bread and tartar sauce. And they couldn't get it. Why? Because now Herod Agrippa the First was in charge, and he said, "Hey, you guys laughed at me." And for 3 years, he had a grain embargo on. Now, they came with one accord to him. They came down to Caesarea and made Blastus their friend and desired peace, because their country was nourished by the king's country. So upon a set day, arrayed in royal apparel, he sat upon his throne and made an oration. I'm going to stop right there and bring you up to date historically. Remember I said that there are 3 things that happened to Herod Agrippa the First that put him on a rise to power. One was the drunken party at Tyre. Secondly was the fact that he made the chariot ride. It ended him in jail, but then he became Caligula's close friend. And thirdly, history records the story of an owl. That's O-W-L, the bird. When he was marching to prison, because he had taken the side of Caligula, they stopped to rest under a tree. Now remember, he's in a line of other prisoners. And all of them are vying for the shade just a little bit. And all of a sudden, history records that they looked up, and right under Agrippa the First, an owl, or he stood and an owl landed above him. Now, in the line of prisoners was a German prince, and evidently, Christian historians say that evidently he was demon-possessed. They just don't know how he could have made this prophecy. But it's recorded in history that he said, introduced himself. He was a German king. And he came over and said, I predict that though you're a prisoner now, in 6 months you'll be a king. And I predict as well, the next time, because of the sign of the owl, that you see an owl, you will die. When you're west of the Levant, the owl, and they were in Italy, west of the Levant, the owl is a symbol of blessing. But east, in the Levant, it's a symbol of cursing. And the German king said, he was captured here, and he was a prisoner, and he said, in 6 months, you will be a king. And in 6 months, Tiberius died. And therefore, Caligula set him free and sent him down there as king. But on the second day of the festival here in Caesarea, he was arrayed in a silver outfit. History tells us that it must have been dazzling, And he was driving in his chariot, and he was heading toward the amphitheater to make this oration. It was the second day of a 5-day feast honoring Caligula for all of his victories and so forth. And somebody said, you better watch out as you're driving. They, again, parked under a tree to receive the accolades of the people. And somebody said, you better watch out because there's an owl in that tree, and you don't want to get your new suit all messy. And Agrippa the First looks up there, and there was the owl. Now this happened historically right before he went in to make the oration. And what did he say in the oration? He was arrayed in royal apparel, sat upon his throne, made an oration. And the people said, now remember, this is the same people who were hungry, who said, yeah, you're a God. Anything, give us grain, you're a God. We'll do anything, our bellies are empty. It's been 3 years now, you're a God. We'll say anything to get you to give us grain. It's the voice of God and not man, the voice of God and not man. And they kept on shouting it and shouting it. What a wonderful man, and he received these accolades. And immediately the angel of the Lord smote him, because he gave not God the glory, and he was eaten of worms and gave up the ghost. Now, he had the exact same disease, but it was more intense. It took him 5 days to die, where Herod the Great, it took him better than a year. And he died. But note what it says. But the word of God grew and multiplied. Verse 22, it's the voice of God and not a man. And he smote him. Verse 24, but the voice of God grew and multiplied. You see, we've got a life and death struggle here with people who want to take over and stand in God's stead rather than give God the glory. Okay, now we're going to have to hurry here. This is the longest family we've ever dealt with, I think, in our lives. But let's move on to chapter 20. We want to go to chapter number 24. And we're going to move from this person down to this person, Drusilla. Now, I'm going to go quickly here, though I could spend a lot of time, but we just don't have that kind of time. Acts 24:24. Now, Herod Agrippa was one who actually had a lot to do with picking the next Caesar. His name was Claudius. His friend Caligula was assassinated. Then he came back down, and he was up in Rome when that happened. So he picked Claudius, the very next Caesar in the line. He came back home, and of course he was killed. But now we have the story of his 3 children here, and we're going to take those up very, very quickly, note them, and especially Agrippa too, and then we will be through. The next child of Herod Agrippa the First that we want to see, or the first child rather, is Drusilla. Now remember that all of these were beautiful people, and Drusilla was very beautiful, though not as beautiful as Bernice. Bernice is said to have been next, of course, to Herodias, one of the most beautiful women in the world. They were redheads, by the way, Herodias and Bernice. And poets wrote about them, and history is filled, secular history is filled with them, as far as literature. But now, because there was a new emperor, his confidants coaxed him to make the southern kingdom, Judea, another governorship or procuratorship. And so therefore, Herod Agrippa II was ruler only of Philip's tetrarchy and of Antipas' tetrarchy. So he only had the northern part. And so therefore, Felix came. He was appointed of Claudius now, the new emperor. Felix came to the south, and he stayed in Jerusalem a while, but he didn't like it there. It was too religious for him, so he went to Caesarea as well. That's why we find the Apostle Paul, once he was in Jerusalem, the chief captain of the Roman guard there took him, put him in prison, and where did he send him for judgment? Remember, Paul came into Jerusalem, and there was a riot in the temple, and he was saved by this guy, Claudius Lysias. And he was the chief captain. What did he do? He wrote a letter and said, Oh, most noble Felix, I've got a problem down here in Jerusalem regarding this man Paul, and so forth. So he sent him with a soldier contingent up to Caesarea, where we find Felix now in charge of all of Judea, the southern province. He doesn't have the northern. Now, they have already talked and so forth. And they've already had a court trial. And after certain days, Felix came back in with his wife Drusilla. Note the phrase, which was a Jewess. Why was she a Jewess? Because she was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I, who was the son of Aristobulus, who was the son of Mariamne. Who else was a Jewess in Scripture? Timothy's mom. Quite a difference, huh? The Apostle Paul says, I'm convinced that the Word of God dwells richly in your mom. And she was called a Jewess. But one was a Jewish believer, the other was a Jewish unbeliever. One was worldly, one was spiritual. Drusilla was a Jewess. And he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. And Paul reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. Here he is telling Felix of the righteousness of God which he lacks, but he's also talking to Drusilla, the fourth generation from Herod the Great, who is facing again probably the greatest genius that has ever lived, the greatest theological genius. There he is in the very courtroom of Felix, and Felix brought his wife Drusilla. Felix said to Drusilla, you just got to hear this man. I mean, this is a fantastic fella. She, being a Jewess, said, okay, I'd like to hear what he has to say. And he reasoned of righteousness. You need to get saved, Felix and Drusilla. You need Jesus Christ. You have absolutely no righteousness of your own. Anything you do is filthy rags, but Christ can save you. He also reasoned of temperance. Now, why did he reason of temperance to Felix and Drusilla? Because Felix loved wine, women, and song. And we'll add another one. He loved money. And that's what he was there for. He was there to try to get tax money for himself in a stealthy way. He wanted to steal it. All right. Now, what about the temperance? Felix was a thief, and he was overtaxing his people for his own profit. Not only that, Felix and Drusilla would tie one on. Now, what about the Roman orgies that Felix and Drusilla and the rest of them would do? Well, we are told by one historian whose book is entitled The Golden Ass. It is a well-recognized historical book. Anyway, in this book, we are told that Roman orgies could last up to 1 month, and this is what they would do. In the morning, they would get up and they would start eating. And they would eat, and they would eat, and they would eat, and then they'd use the feather method, and then they would start eating again. The feather method is to disgorge it, and so forth. They were the original anorexics and bulimics of, of their time, and they would do that until noon. And at noontime they would go to the bath and just pamper the body and so forth. And then from that time on they would start drinking. And they would drink all afternoon, and in the late afternoon they would bring forth the dancing girls, and of course there was all the orgies and the fornication and so forth. And from that time they would just take a little rest. If they needed to use the feather again, they would, because at night they would throw the real banquet. And this book, The Golden Ass, tells us that a Roman banquet could have from 25 to 40 courses of food plus wine. And about every 5 or 6 courses, they'd use the feather and come back in and eat again. That's why he said, hey, temperance, you're taxing your people illegally, and you're using the tax money simply to waste food that could be going to help people who are legitimately working. Now, here is a case where you have an authority who has gone awry, and judgment to come. What happened? Felix trembled, and he said, go your way for this time till I have a convenient season. See, unbelievers always want a convenient season whenever they come under conviction, and he was under conviction. He trembled. The Apostle Paul, Jesus said it's hard for you to kick against the pricks. Here we have the emotions of Felix going awry. He hoped also, note verse 26, he's holding out to the end, that money should have been given him to Paul that he might loose him. That's why he sent for him the oftener. Now what happened? Verse 27. After 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room. Now why did Felix have to leave? Because the Jews sent to Claudius and said, if you don't remove this guy for what he's doing, we're going to revolt. So Claudius pulled Felix back to Rome. Felix bought territory on Mount Vesuvius. He housed Drusilla and their child there, and Drusilla died when Mount Vesuvius exploded. Now we're going to move to 2 more, Agrippa and Bernice, very quickly. Porcius Festus came 2 years later. But Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound. So he's just simply passed the buck to the next guy. When Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Now, afterwards he came back to Caesarea, verse 9. He wanted to do the Jews a pleasure. Now remember, these guys constantly had to placate the Jews because they were going to revolt. You've got to do this, said the Jews, or we're going to revolt against you. So they had to walk on thin ice with these Jews. Willing to do the Jews a pleasure, he answered Paul, will you go with me to Jerusalem? And Paul said, no, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat. Okay, so it's at this point in Caesarea that we're now introduced to the last 2 people of our study. After certain days, verse 13, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. Now remember, Caesarea is down in the southern province. Galilee is north. Where's Agrippa to and Bernice? North. They come down from Galilee to Caesarea again to have a Roman orgy. How do we know? And when they had been there many days. That many days there indicates a long party that they threw. So, Felix and Drusilla are not the only 2 that like to party. So, after many days, Felix declared Paul's cause unto the king. There is a man left here in bonds by Felix. And he relates the story of Paul's imprisonment and so forth. Now, we're not going to go through all of this, except we're going to come to chapter 26 now. And we're going to go to verse number 21. Now, let me remind you of these 2 people. Bernice and Agrippa II were children of Herod Agrippa I. So they both were partial Jews as well. Bernice was married to Herod of Chalcis, but she didn't like her uncle, and she ran away from him. Later, he died. I don't know if he was heartbroken or what, but she, again, was a very beautiful woman. He was somewhat older, and she ran from him and died. She came down and lived in incense with her brother, Agrippa II, in Galilee. Remember, he had the northern territory there. So here comes Porcius Festus down from Rome, being appointed of Claudius, and they decide that they need to have good relations with him. So they come down and have this party. Now, in the meantime, Porcius Festus, being a smart man like Felix, that is, as far as trying to pass the buck and that sort of thing, said, I know what I'll do. No, not like Felix, but like Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate said, Herod's in town, I'm going to pass the buck to him. And Festus said, Agrippa II's in town, I'm just going to pass the buck to him. Why don't you hear this case, Agrippa, and we'll go by what you say in the judgment. Well, verse 21. Follow with me, and we're almost done. For these causes, and he's relating his story, Paul's talking, the Jews caught me in the temple, went about to kill me. I've obtained help from God to continue to this day. I've witnessed none of the things but the prophets and Moses should come. That Christ would suffer, they would rise from the dead, show forth to the people, the Jews, and to the Gentiles. Now you remember that both groups are represented in this courtroom now. Agrippa II and Bernice are Jews. In fact, Drusilla is called a Jewess. That makes Bernice a Jewess. And Agrippa II was also an Old Testament scholar, and he knew the religion of the Jews. He was not an ignorant man, because all of these people, going all the way back to Antipas, were under the direction of Israel at this time, the rise in their nationality, and they were absolutely brought up with a knowledge of the Old Testament and Judaism. Therefore, verse 24, as he spake, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, much learning doth make thee mad. Now, why did he do that? I believe he was somewhat embarrassed. He was probably under conviction. He probably, he got Agrippa II into this, and now he's trying to make excuses for the situation. I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth, speak forth words of truth and soberness, which, by the way, these people were probably not. Or at least they were getting over a month-long hangover. The king, Agrippa II, knows of these things before whom I speak freely. I am persuaded that none of these things are hidden from him, for this thing was not done in a corner. Now, what was not done in a corner? You have to remember that this is just 4 generations removed from Herod the Great. What happened that was passed down? First of all, the death of the children in the Bethlehem area. The wise men coming. And everything that Herod the Great did. Passed it down to Aristobulus. Aristobulus passed it down to Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I passed it down to Agrippa II. They kept telling what had happened. It was not done in a corner. Everybody knew about Christ, about his crucifixion, about his apostles, and now about Paul. They simply, word of mouth, it was passed along. It was all in the Levant area. Therefore, he says, King Agrippa, 4th generation from Herod the Great. Do you believe the prophets? Now, inherent in the language is a reply. In other words, Agrippa II is nodding. Yeah, I believe. I believe what they say. In fact, Herod the Great believed, because the very first thing he did when the wise men said, "Where's he that is born King of the Jews?" was call the Sanhedrin in there to find out from the prophets which city would he be located in. So there was an academic assent of faith there. Agrippa said to Paul, "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." Now, they did not believe. Almost. You almost did it. You almost had me convinced. Yes, I know the prophets. Yes, I know all about the circumstance and situation. What happened? The king rose up, and the governor, this is Agrippa II and Festus, and Bernice, and they that sat with them, and said, verse 32, this man might have been set at liberty if he had not appealed to Caesar. Now, at least Agrippa was fair. Oh, well, the Jews don't have a case against him. We could have set him free. But remember, Festus wanted him to go back to Jerusalem. If he had done so, he would have been killed there. But secondly, Jesus Christ told the Apostle Paul, you have testified of me at Jerusalem. You will also testify of me where? At Rome also. That's why he appealed to Caesar. You got to take me there. What happened to Agrippa and Bernice? Later on, we have the revolt in Palestine. Agrippa went up to Rome and died in obscurity. Bernice became the mistress of Vespasian, later Titus. When they were going to get married, the Roman Senate wouldn't let them, and everybody stayed clear of Bernice. She died in the slums of Rome of starvation. And there you have the story of the 4-generation curse and how it fits in the scriptural narrative.